You're listening to the Book Talk Today podcast, a podcast that inspires readers to obtain valuable insights to inform, educate, and improve lives. My name is Orn Abdi. I'm an avid reader, best known for the creation of the 1 Minute Book Review community, and I'm sitting down with authors to delve deeper into the books they have written to uncover the story behind the story. Hello everyone and welcome to episode 29 of the Book Talk Today podcast. Today we are joined by Theo Priestley and Bronwyn Williams. Theo is a globally recognized futurist. He has delivered keynotes internationally and articles have been featured in Forbes and Wired, to name a few. Bronwyn is a leading futurist and trend analyst. She has presented and consulted to businesses and governments across Africa, and today we'll be discussing their book, The Future Starts Now. Theo and Bronwyn, it's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you for asking.
You're welcome. So today I wanted to obviously discuss the book in a bit more depth. I think this topic is something that's on a global agenda given the last year or so, even, trending the last decade or so with technology. And I think a great place to start would be, what was the intention behind writing this book now?
I'll take that one, I guess. So I think Brownyn and I probably wanted to write a book for a while, individually ourselves, and as an endeavor, it's quite a big project to take on. Plus, we're not experts in every single facet of future studies and the topics that are covered in the book. So the easiest way to do that was actually, divide and conquer, which is, well, how can we tackle such a huge topic as what does the future look like, covering multiple angles? And the best way to do that is actually invite people to contribute to that and actually have this really wide, diverse range of voices who are experts and passionate about those particular topics, who do consult with organizations and who do come from all four corners of the world. So they have that kind of unique perspective and unique voices that we couldn't do on our own. And that was the reason and inspiration behind the book, really. And I guess the timing was a little bit fortuitous, a little bit knocked by the pandemic as well. But I think as people come out of the pandemic, they're now head scratching, going, right, well, that took us blindsided. What do we need to think about now? And I'm hoping this kind of sort of stirs up some passion about what people wanted to start to take a more active role in shaping a future rather than just being following what people are dictating it should be.
I can absolutely just jump in there and just add to that slightly. In that, as Theo says, like, we've all tried to write things about the future ourselves, but very quickly you sort of get to look at yourself and realize that the biggest problems with the future are prescriptive futures that are being sort of preached at you by some one person from writing some book or standing on some stage. So that sort of self-awareness was very, very quickly sort of fell into our laps. I thought, well, maybe we actually need to talk to other people about this, because if the message we are busy preaching or trying to get across is a message that the future should be more participative, then it's somewhat disingenuous to sit and write a book about what the world should be all by yourself. So I think that's another sort of reason why because the future is supposed to be a team sport, it makes sense that writing about it is also a team sport, that we actually sort of living out the values that we say. And Theo and I both write a lot and speak a lot about how most of the big problems with the future are the fact that you're getting these one-size-fits-all visions that are bestowed upon us from above, from the richest, from the most powerful, from the loudest voices in the room. And that's what the real problem is. So we didn't want to be part of that problem. We wanted to rather do something a bit different, a bit more collaborative. And really we have, and I think, pretty good job of that, of getting voices from not just new and different voices, but also voices from different geographic regions, from very different socioeconomic backgrounds, because that's the point. Everything is connected and everyone has to be talking to each other. Otherwise, things are only going to get worse.
I think that was part of the book that I liked in particular, was that global aspect to it, because you either have, when I've read books on the future or artificial intelligence, it's very much one person, whether they are an expert in their field, talking about it through let's say a physics perspective, or then an actual artificial programming perspective, but it's not like a holistic view about the issue. And I feel like a conversation, and I feel like when I read the book, it was more of a conversation with the reader in the sense of, okay, this is the possibilities, this is what it could look like, and this is potentially where you fit into it. Was it very much written with that in mind?
Yeah, it really was. I mean, when we first sort of pitched this idea to the publisher and to the contributors that we sort of handpicked and sort of corralled into being part of this whole project, we wrote them a letter and we said that, you know, we said essentially the future needs you to be part of this project, and we want to sort of extend that message on to the reader too, which hopefully we did get across in the book. This point is, it's not a sort of a passive read. We're not here to tell you stories so you can go and put yourself to bed after you've finished listening to us tell you about the world. It's a call to action. It's saying, you don't like this, you've got to go out there and fix it. Otherwise, this is pretty much what you're going to get. So that was very much the intention. I think that's why the publisher and why so many contributors and people like yourself have been so supportive of this whole idea, is that it's not just a case of us selling our egos and our worldview as to what should be, where we're more saying we have to be talking about these things. There's nothing more depressing than these sort of utopian ideals. And we all know that utopias are all just another word for dystopia in another sort of sense, that are being sort of handed to us and saying, yeah, accept this. This is your future, and it's smaller than your past, but be happy anyway. So we really want to change that conversation and just get people talking about it, because that's the first step. Once you empower people with knowledge and ideas and just invite them into the conversation, you can see how much more exciting things can be and how the future horizons then open up rather than shut down. I think that, again, that's what Theo and I have been talking about for years, like from when we first sort of connected with each other online. It's about the whole fact that the future is like not what it used to be. It used to be a lot more exciting. And now the future is like scary and it's dark and it's limited. I mean, the whole point of the future's philosophy, and that we all talk about, whether we're in academia or off on the sort of future speaking circuit stage, is about the future is like a cone. It's a cone of possibility. It broadens out in front of you. But all the narratives we're hearing in the media and from political leaders and from conversations around us are about the future being smaller than the past, which is so incredibly wrong on so many levels. And that was really the first thing that I think we really are passionate about wanting to change. I mean, where are the big exciting goals for the future? Instead, all we talk about is sort of vaccine passports and degrowth economics, and that's all that's left of our once glorious future. And we really need to start changing that conversation.
When you've seen that change over time, where do you feel like not the blame, so to say, but why do you think that change in perspective has happened over time? I think it would be good to talk about perhaps the change between a utopian to a dystopian view of the future. You touched upon it in the book, but I think it would be good to discuss it now.
I'll start, and then I'm sure Theo can pick up, because he's probably got a slightly different perspective. This is not a conversation that we've had with each other, but I think we've come to similar sort of realizations in the present moment. But I do come from an economics background, looked at sort of macro trends and cycles and things going on in the world. And it did seem to be that the sort of golden age for futures was in the beginning point of the last century. And ironically, when things were going worse, we had better visions about the future. I mean, the first couple of decades of the last century are a pretty atrocious period to be alive, from extreme climate like we don't even understand going on, like the Dust Bowls, to the Great Depression, to the perpetual wars that didn't seem to end. But in amongst that chaos, we still had people dreaming about things that were better, a different sort of world. That's when you had all your science fiction comic books coming out, and your movies, and all the great authors that I refer to even today seem to have come sort of before them. And then things got good and we got comfortable. And suddenly we started to have this sense, especially I'm talking now around sort of 1950s, 1960s, that this was good and it's all going pretty good, and we must sort of like stop rocking the boat. This is okay. It could be worse. A great parallel to that is actually what's gone on in China at the moment, where the current generation is kind of okay with the status quo because it's better than what the past was. And that was the sort of start of this whole sort of postalgian wave that we saw, where it was this sort of the sinister underlying sense that this is as good as it's going to get, and that anything else that happens from here on out is going to be worse. So we need to preserve. So it was a sort of a conservation mindset that took over society, almost a casualty of our own success, rather than a progressive mindset that believed that we could change things and that we should change things. Both the idea that we can and that we should progress are now under question. And both of those are very retarding factors on any sort of dreaming up of anything going on to the future. And just as that sort of nostalgia settled in across Western society in particular, we also had the other big change that took place where we started uncoupling ourselves from reality. And that this happened on many different levels. Like computing actually started in the 1970s, and we started to digitize society, but at the same time, also started experimenting more with sort of mind-altering drugs and more sort of speculative fiction rather than science fiction, which is a bit different. And a lot of our entertainment trends and our societal trends tended towards escapism. And if you're escaping to another place, you don't need to fix what's going on in the world. You don't need to dream up stuff. You're already living the dream. And that's probably a more sort of altruistic way to look at it. But for both from very practical, hard reasons and for soft reasons, people became more conservative and more escapist. And neither of those are progressive forces for society. And, you know, history does go in cycles. We're in pretty tough times, hard times at the moment. So it's a good time to be talking about the next wave of progress, because as those old sort of trite sayings go, you know, hard times create great men. So we're overdue for some great men with some great big plans. But the problem that we've seen, Theo and I, is that this time around, when we have big problems, the ideas are quite small ideas. In fact, they're recycled ideas. Are we still talking about the flying cars that people dreamt up 100 years ago? What is our generation's aspirational flying car? There isn't any. All the future utopian ideas are old ideas. There are no really new ideas as to what can come next. And Theo, you're welcome to jump in there and correct me as to your view on what happened over the last 100 years.
I do not have any disagreeing comments on that at all. I've spoken a number of times about my passion for the old sort of World's Fair back in the 1920s and 30s. And like you say, we had just come out of one world war. There was a Great Depression. You had the Roaring '20s where everyone kind of felt, oh, this is great. We can get back on our feet again. There was a lot of positivity. And as a result of that, there was a lot of thinking around what the future could look like. So like flying cars or even like self-driving cars were, you know, back then they were actually trying to say, oh, this is our future. We can create self-driving cars, massive amounts of home automation where you didn't have to do anything. You just throw in some ingredients and the kitchen would cook it for you and you didn't have to do anything. And you look now and what do we have? We have people building apps and things which are meant to distract. Because if you distract a population, it's like television. And I think George Orwell said this, which was, you know, television is a means to distract the masses from what's really happening. And now we have the 21st century equivalent, which is, you know, Facebook, all these apps that we have, which is essentially just getting people to talk about really mundane things, really things that have no real value, so that other people can actually dream of the future that they want to build, and you just have to be a part of it, whether you like it or not. It's amazing how quickly we've gone from you know, a bright future to something dystopian just by looking at Black Mirror as well, for example. So when Black Mirror came out, it was like, oh, I don't like that. That's terrible. And then when you get to the end of the last season, it's like, well, that kind of feels like normality now because we're already there. So Black Mirror has already been overtaken by reality in a sense. And I don't think Charlie Brooker can actually write anything worse than real life anymore. So the book, in a sense, kind of walks through, and I'm glad you actually said it was like a conversation, because it very much felt like, you know, we didn't want to have this dictation, like Brownyn was saying, you know, you read this chapter and it's being read to you. You want to have that kind of sort of backwards and forwards in your own head, imagining that you were having a conversation with one of the people who wrote the chapter. And we want people to start having that kind of sort of conversation in their head to say, right, well, what do I want the future to look like? Why can't I try to make some kind of positive impact? And how do I go about making that positive impact? And the final chapter in the book is essentially how we as futurists go about our daily business. It's almost like a 101 tour of the basics of futurism, and it gives you kind of like the tools to sort of start thinking in that mindset. And we want people to sort of go on that journey themselves, to take more responsibility in a sense, to start shaping it, because we at the moment are all just passengers, on someone else's vision, and that vision isn't particularly an exciting one like it was back in the 20s. So we've come 100 years from 1920s for the roaring times. We're now in 2020s, where we've come through another global kind of event, which is a pandemic. Wouldn't it be great if we came out and had roaring 20s again, and that kind of inspiration, and everybody wanted a part of it, not just the Googles and the Facebooks and the Microsofts and that kind of sort of thing.
The interesting thing that you picked up upon, which is something I wanted to discuss, was the fact that perhaps people have got used to the way that it is, and they are being fed information in a way and they feel like comfortable. Because I think what Brownyn talked about earlier, and the fact that there is a level of comfort that perhaps people don't feel like they need to be having this conversation because everything's fine at the moment, but perhaps they don't see where it's going. And one of the things that I took from the book was the element of privacy, because people almost feel as if privacy is no longer a thing because internet's there, all their information's online, and they don't particularly care what people do with it because they see the ease of it. But I think there's obviously a danger in doing that. I wanted to ask Brownyn that because I think in her chapter, she talked about privacy and the issues of privacy. So could you just speak to that a bit, Brownyn, and about some of the issues that privacy will bring for the individual, and why individuals who are perhaps sharing their information online need to be perhaps concerned with that?
Yeah, so privacy is so closely related with identity, and identity is so closely related with any sort of sense of progress, because if we're not an I, these are the basic philosophical questions that we speak about as human beings, we have done throughout history. If there's not an I, if there's not something that we are attached to and that we have for ourselves, that we are progressing towards, there's not much point in being alive, quite frankly. I mean, this is what it really boils down to when you talk about the human experience. What are we, like slightly interestingly dressed apes sort of clinging to our third rock from the sun and hurtling through space to an uncertain fate? That's quite depressing when you are just part of a homogenous collective. And this concept of privacy means holding something back from society, means having essentially things like free will and self-direction and the ability to change things. If you don't have that, then we shouldn't even be having this conversation at all, because everything is just inevitable and we should just accept whatever is being handed to us. Yeah. But that for me is not an acceptable endpoint for my experience here on Spaceship Earth. So I am going to take the opportunity to remind people that keeping something back, having some boundary between yourself and society, everything else, is really essential to living a fulfilled life. And progress, if you look at it even from a completely evolutionary perspective, relies on both collaboration and on conflict. And conflict requires having some sorts of other or some sort of other voice. That's not to say it's got to be violent conflict, but you need to have some sort of grist in the mill in order to have any sort of progress to survive. The alternative is stagnation. Full-on cooperation is just another form of death, because that is entire stasis. This is like from a purely biological perspective. So that's probably quite a sort of esoteric way to talk around the idea of privacy, but there's very practical tools to that too, in that privacy is, to many intents and purposes, a common good. And as such, it's at risk of the tragedy of the commons, because, my putting up a Ring camera outside my house invades your privacy, even though I'm doing it for me. And I've got a good reason to, invade your privacy, but I have less of a good reason to prevent you from invading mine in exchange. So it has to be spoken about from a collective commons point of view, and to say that common goods require common ideas to sort of protect them. And it's quite interesting, the EU now is actually coming out against, ubiquitous surveillance and actually drawing that sort of line in the sand, which for me is quite encouraging. Because we talk about progress a lot, and I'm a tech optimist. I think it's great we're making and building and developing new things, but we have to also think about the consequences of what things we're choosing to build. I'm not someone who's saying we shouldn't progress. I think we should. I think we should do many more things. I think we've done far less things than we should have. But it's not to say that everything is necessarily a good idea. And where these concepts become quite dangerous, it also comes back to the thesis of the book itself, is that one of the reasons that is not very well spoken about, because it's very, very uncomfortable, that we don't have new visions of the future, that our aspirations from a tech and societal perspective are 100-year-old aspirations, is because most people working in the futures and tech space are kind of seeing a cliff ahead for humanity. like an AI singularity, for example, or an extinction event, or a post-human transition. They're seeing an end point for us rather than a continuation point. And these conversations are very, very uncomfortable, because when you start having these conversations, all people at the cutting edge of their field kind of have the same idea. There's like a cliff at the end of the road. And because no one is prepared to talk about that cliff and no one wants to sort of deal with the elephant in the room, we kind of stuck where we are. And the whole concept of privacy and identity is one of those things that is threatened to sort of fall into that hole, because a lot of these sort of singularities and sugar cubing of your mind and post-human transition involve a complete eradication of the individual and who that person is. And I suppose the question or the challenge I want to put to readers is to say, it's not necessary. There can be other routes. Not all routes have to end in a sort of singularity black hole, a post-human existence. We can think and dream of new ideas, but that requires holding on to some sort of individuality. Because if we don't have that, there's no point in trying to avoid that hole. But there are ways around it. I mean, we can build tech to talk to tech. And one of my favorite examples there would be how we've now got sort of GPT-3 writing SEO optimized articles for websites that no human being will ever read. So now we've got bots talking to bots and just sort of dealing with each other over there. And that's another version of the future we could be exploring, where sort of bots have their old world and we can go take a bottle of wine and a book to the beach and live a very human existence. So we have to get past the inevitability of these things. And I think privacy is probably one of the further forward, one of the more imminent challenges we have to deal with as a society, to say, why does this matter? And I think it's one of those sort of lines in the sand that we kind of have to take at some point. Otherwise, we are just sort of sleepwalking into that singularity black hole, which pretty much all routes to the future seem to lead to, because no one wants to talk about trying to avoid them.
It seems like all the experts, whether it be Elon Musk or I've read books by Max Tegmark and Nick Bostrom, it seems like all of them have this idea that there will be an AGI, an artificial general intelligence. And I know Max Tegmark talks about it in Life 3.0. He talks about like the Prometheus, the idea that it will take over governments and it will be surveilling people and it will have its foot in the economic and the political way, you know, with elections and deciphering elections and these types of things. Do you think part of the problem is there are experts in the field who are talking about it in a very negative point of view, and the conversation isn't so much about the potential for it, but it's the negative downsides of it?
It's not just the potential, it's the inevitability this is presented as. I mean, like Nick Bostrom is sort of held up as sort of like the Bible of AI. But his thesis is based, is premised on a whole lot of assumptions that are not necessarily true. And I think it's Stephen's chapter in our book sort of talks to that a little bit about how, you know, AI is not inevitable the way the biggest voices in the room have been speaking about. We're making a whole lot of assumptions about things like consciousness, which we don't fully understand, and about trajectories and about sort of perpetual progress in particular directions, which based on common sense don't necessarily play out in reality. There are really limits to any sort of size of growth or scale. So there's going to be bumps in that road. And I know that like the rationalist community, for example, believes that sort of like preventing or at least directing AI is the biggest sort of most noble goal we can possibly spend our existence trying to avoid or direct. But we've got a whole lot of other stuff to deal with in our own lifetimes before we get there. And these big challenges are paralyzing. They're part of that nostalgia problem, because the subtext is it's inevitable. We're going to get to a point where human beings are redundant, you know. So and if there is that like finite cliff, then what's the point of talking about the future? So it sort of dims all those headlights right down. This is why we don't have far futures discussions anymore, because like they're all in that black hole at some point, right? And the question is, do we want that? I mean, some of your oldest sort of science fiction writers, like your Asimovs, have spoken about this. You know, like the whole point of human existence as our individual lives and as a society at large is to sort of, you know, rage against the dying of the light. And hopefully our book gets people encouraged to do that. We probably won't be around forever as a species, but we don't have to sort of accept our fate so passively. We should be trying to extend our civilizational lifespan as much as we try and extend our own lives and preserve the lives of our families and friends. I don't know if you want to jump in there, Theo, because I'm going quite far down that rabbit hole myself.
No, Well, firstly, I want to pick up on the term comfortable, and I think we shouldn't confuse comfortability with apathy. And I think there's a general apathy rather than comfortability in society right now, where people just don't care about what's going on to a certain extent. And privacy is one thing. I mean, we've seen. Well, what was the latest one? 500 million. Was it 500 million? Facebook accounts leaked online. And then Clubhouse, 1 million email addresses and contact details from Clubhouse are now on the internet as well. And the last wave with Cambridge Analytica, and everyone was like, oh, everyone's going to dump, we're going to dump Facebook. That's it. Had enough. Well, what was the real attrition rate? Probably very, very small. And then when you look at it, it's always the same people crying out, going, oh, this is terrible. And it's the tech pundits. Whereas the general population are just like, well, I don't care. You know, I can still talk to my family, and I can still talk to my friends, and I can still post memes and stuff like that. So again, it goes back to, you know, if you distract them enough, they just, you know, they're comfortable, but they also don't care. They're just apathetic to it all. But then when we get down to the AI question, I absolutely agree with Bronwyn in that all these experts and things paint this very negative view, and you know there's going to be one age. You know, let's put it this way: there is not going to be a Skynet. There's not going to be one Skynet that's going to take over everything and stuff like that, because no country and no technology company will ever accept the fact that there will only be one, and it won't be theirs. You know, there will be multiple AGIs kicking around, and probably we'll have some kind of bot war. You know, where they try, you know, where they try and solve tic-tac-toe, or you know, like Whopper did in what was it, War Games? But there isn't going to be like one overlord in terms of artificial general intelligence. And like Bronwyn touched upon, we don't even understand our own consciousness. We can map what happens in the brain in terms of neurons and how that works. And synaptic pathways and things, but we still don't actually understand why the brain is here, what it does. So saying that we can create something artificial and just feed it some data, ones and zeros, and expect it to perform exactly the same way as a brain will is just absolute nonsense. What we might find is we will find some kind of artificial entity. Whether it's intelligence is another matter entirely. It might be on a different scale of intelligence, and how can we measure something that we have no understanding of ourselves? If we create something brand new, we can't really classify it because it's just something that we've never encountered before. And then, as usual, once we get scared, we'll probably pull the plug anyway. So I think before we'll pull the plug on an emerging AI well before it even gets to an AGI level, just purely out of that or there are some AGIs sitting in a lab somewhere that are not connected to the internet for a reason, but we won't go down that conspiracy rabbit hole.
I don't know. Is that a well-known conspiracy? I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
It is.
Okay. Can you talk about that a bit?
That's the idea of keeping it in a sort of an Oracle of Delphi type box to stop the AI escaping and destroying the world. But it's still premised on the idea that even a completely artificial general intelligence, vastly superior to our own, has a consciousness and a will to either progress or destroy, and that is a huge assumption. There's no actual data to say that could happen, and that will to continually progress or to destroy something else is the missing link in any sort of, you know, singularity, computers take over and kill us all.
I think the assumption that I see is very much that the AI or the AGI acts in the same manner and emotion that the human does.
Yeah,
I feel like that is the massive assumption that is being made by most people.
It'll want to help or destroy us, or whatever that case is. But it's the concept of want that is missing from these things, because our most powerful technologies right now are already vastly superior to us at doing particular tasks, but they're all human programmed tasks. They haven't created new drives. They might have created new ways to achieve the goals that we have given them, but they have, or even a perpetually repeating goal. We could give it to an entity like that, but we're not able to bestow desire, drive, free will, all of these consciousness things onto this. It's the theory is that it could be emergent at any point and just sort of wakes up one day. But we don't know that. That's an assumption. So it shouldn't be sold to the general public as an inevitability. It should be sold as an interesting philosophical challenge, much like the insides of our own brain. And I think there's many more sort of pressing issues when it comes to the transhuman experience, like we already have cyborgs. In fact, we had cyborgs writing in our book for us. I mean, Nick's a cyborg, right? You know, like sort of genetically enhanced and technologically enhanced humans walking among us. That's much more pressing problems because it's already here. That is a reality, not a speculation. And it could be amazing or it could be quite awful, depending on whether you tend to be someone who values growing the pie or someone who tends to value sharing the pie. So this comes down to your classic sort of left-right political divides, is where we're going to see all sorts of conflict popping up. And those are things we have to deal with right now. And that's going to affect the readers of our book and their children happening now. So hopefully we can just start being a bit more sort of practical about where we direct our outrage and fear to get to a point where we're actually moving and not just sort of standing still and waiting for the sort of avalanche to fall on us.
Interestingly, the more I read about artificial intelligence, it seems like every single book, and including yours, talks about consciousness and defining meaning. Because in the book, you talk about meaning and getting into what is human values and how do you derive meaning. Because it seems like the more that I particularly read about artificial intelligence, it's very much about, okay, what is the human condition? What does it mean to be human? Because if we can't define what it means to be human, how can we go about living a life where we live alongside artificial intelligence? Because that calls into a question what it means to be human. So I feel like it's much more of a conversation around human meaning and deriving meaning from becoming human or being human, rather than perhaps just growing artificial intelligence.
Yeah, what we are and who we are and what we're doing here on the planet. Those are the basic questions. And like there's a reason why future studies and foresight is actually a philosophy sort of function in universities. It's very much entwined because it is about questions about meaning. It's not just empirical questions, also instrumental questions as to what we're doing, why we're doing things, what do we actually want to materialize. And that comes down to sort of basic ethos of, like, as Theo was saying, the Futures 101 sort of section in the book. It's about understanding that we have to understand trends in play, but also to understand that we can change those trends. You know, you can shift it, but then the question becomes, you know, the difference between sins of omission and sins of commission. You know, like, what are you actually doing with that new knowledge and power, which is scary once again. So it makes a lot of sense how people would want to sort of conserve today and escape using all the marvelous new escapism tools. But hopefully we can sort of jolt people out of that complacency on the one hand, and also alert people to the value of actually living a real life rather than sort of being sucked into an artificial escapism world, whether that's through sort of mind-altering substances or through just a complete escape into the metaverse, all of which are wonderful things, but they are, as Theo was saying, distractions from what we're doing here and why. And you can sort of put those questions off for all your life or for your entire species sort of journey, but then you really are sleepwalking into that sort of singularity one way or another. And is that should we be okay with that? I'm not. That's why we're writing the book. Otherwise, if we didn't care about anything, then we wouldn't do such things.
You wouldn't be writing the book, would you? Of course not. No. You wouldn't be talking about it.
We wouldn't be talking about it. I'm happy to rage against the dying of the light. So
rage against the machine.
Rage against the machines, literally.
Yeah, literally rage against the machines. Interestingly, for me, it feels like it's more of an elitist thing, the artificial intelligence. One of the stories that you talked about in the book, which I think was quite prevalent, is the fact that you have all these Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, whether they be Peter Thiel or the Sergey Brin from Google, that are doing all this stuff about living longer, and they want to live for, let's say, hundreds of years or thousands of years, whatever it might be. But it feels like a lot of it is elitism, whether it be financially or they have access to this level of resource that perhaps the general population don't do. And I feel like, for instance, most of the general population think that these questions are just like, well, that's not, I won't have access to that, so what's the point of me thinking about it? Do you feel like part of this conversation is somewhat blurred because it feels like it's very much an elitists versus the rest kind of conversation?
Absolutely. I mean, if you take Elon Musk, for example, and his mission about propagating the species and civilization to Mars, He paints the grand vision, and we all see a lovely picture and concept art renders of a Martian colony, when we know full well that the people who go out there will be forced to build it. And it's pretty much what he's offering is indentured servitude for probably the next 100, 200 years for the people who actually want to go out and live there. It's not going to build itself. Someone else is going to have to build it. And he'll stand on the shoulders of those poor, broken people in order to make it happen. And it's the same with, it's almost the rich are teasing us in a sense. And again, it's that, oh, we are so close to making us live for another 100 years with our genetic technology or whatever, or cryogenically freezing us, blah, blah, blah. But it's not for you. But here's what is for you. It's this nice little VR toy that you can plug yourself into and get distracted. Or we'll masquerade it as something fun, when in actual fact it's work, because what you're actually doing is doing more work to make sure that I have money to make sure that I can live forever. So they're not going to carry us along. All this stuff about space tourism and space hotels and stuff. I mean, we've all seen movies like Elysium, for example, from Neil Blomkamp, who's South African. I think he's South African. He is, isn't he? Yeah. And that's a wonderful picture of what it's going to look like if we don't take a stand. I'm not saying take a stand and Brownyn raging against the machines and we all light torches and stuff like that. But if we want a stake in that future, we have to take a stand now and just say that future belongs to me as well. I don't want to be sitting here on Earth without access to basic medical care while you guys are up on your space hotel and your space cities and whatnot, and you have access to everything. It shouldn't be like this, but unfortunately, technology is creating this kind of divide in society and the equality gap even more, I think. And again, it boils down to the fact that all these people have an agenda. The agenda is not our agenda because it doesn't involve us. They're telling us what the future should look like because it's how they want to shape it. And we're all just being apathetic towards it and happy to be carried along and distracted by some new things that come along to keep us occupied. I did a TED talk about, would you follow a robot leader? Would you actually allow someone like a robot politician to actually rule a country? All this automation should actually free us from that, to start having those conversations with ourselves and with other people and start thinking bigger again. It's back to that whole, we aren't having those grand visions anymore because we're all just too busy running along 9 to 5. And I actually wonder that if the pandemic was a good thing. It is and it isn't, but from a wake-up call, in terms of, well, what have I been doing with my life? I'm sitting at home now and I'm being forced to sort of sit in front of a screen. Is this really what I want to do for the rest of my life? The settings have changed and the way we work has changed, and hopefully that's allowed people to sort of think, do I want to pour my entire life or 70 years of my life into what I've been told is a career? Or do I actually want to explore what it means to be me as a person and start writing or start drawing or painting or learning a musical instrument, stuff that I never had the capacity to do before? And this is what all this talk about AI should be taking us on this journey, which is giving us that capacity to learn to do something more, to learn humanities, to push the humanities and the philosophies and things like that back in the agenda rather than the technologies. We're being technologically led at the expense of thinking, and technology should be used to switch that back around.
Do you feel like the humanities have become over politicized? That's part of the issue, I feel like. For me anyway, when I studied, because I studied politics at university, and right. I felt like it was more about the conversation of who was right rather than what is the future. And that's why I feel like with politics at the moment, it's like, okay, who's right at the moment rather than what's the best outcome for the future. And I feel like that's a major flaw in the political environment at the moment. It's very much one side shouting at the other rather than, okay, what's the best future for us all? And it's a real failing, I feel like, of some system. I don't know whether it is actually the political or the economic system. Perhaps we can have a conversation about that. But I definitely feel like there's a flaw in the system, in how governments are run, or the political system in general.
Yeah, I mean, again, it goes back to there's no future thinking beyond the next term.
Yeah.
So it's just every 4 years I'll think of something new, but all I want to do is get to that fourth year myself, and so that just stunts everyone's thinking.
Yeah.
And it's the same as how projects are run in organizations as well. You know, I want to build this tool or something to make my business look better. I'm going to plan it for 3 years and we'll see what happens in 3 years. There's no massive long-term vision that says, what do I really want to build this business for? And what is the impact of this business? And is it actually doing anything good, or is it just a case of it makes money and that's about it? And I think, I think you're right in terms of the way governments are thinking, which is just, I'll think on a term-based, on a term-based basis, and nothing about well, what's the future of the country that I'm actually governing, and then how does that country integrate with every other country? I mean, we've seen with the pandemic, even as something as far-reaching and global as a pandemic has exposed how insular or insulated each country leader is still thinking. And now we're now having a kind of drug war, in a sense that, oh, it's my vaccine, you're not getting any of this. Let's stop the shipment there because we don't want you getting it, and stuff like that. And it's like, no, why? This affects us all. We should all be working together. We actually have a common goal for once. It's not like we had, with the world wars, it was just like, oh, everybody pile on Germany, and everyone else had agendas with Japan and things like that. We have a singular thing that affects us all, and it's just one thing, and everybody should be focused on actually solving this one problem. But what we found is, again, it just causes all these little silly squabbles. It's like, Lord of the Flies and back in the school playground again, but just on another scale. It's quite sad.
Yeah, it is interesting to observe it, and perhaps it will be something that is written about a lot posthumously, because I feel like once you're in the middle of it, it's difficult to sort of see the repercussions of it. So perhaps that could be it. One of the things that was interesting, and we touched upon it with, for instance, space travel, or what it is creating new forms of mankind, is the issue of actually just replicating what we've done here with on, whether we move to Mars, and we're just replicating the ideas and the economic systems and the political systems. There was a chapter in the book, I can't remember the individual who wrote about it, but talked about the difficulties or some of the issues with just transferring the way of thinking. And it's actually important to have new systems, create new systems of governance, create new systems of economy, so that it is benefiting the population into the future, rather than just replicating the old ones. Do you feel like that's the case?
I think that was probably Mathana's chapter on his No Money Beyond Mars chapter.
Yeah, I think that
it ties up very nicely with this conversation. It's much like I was saying, when you come to sort of far future visions, they all sort of fall into the singularity black hole, and it's all sort of becomes one sort of dead end. Our midterm sort of futures are also another dead end. And by midterm, I'm talking like the viable futures for most of us alive today. And all roads seem to be leading towards a sort of a neo-feudal dystopia, whereby the rich live behind walls, whether they're walls on a spaceship, or whether they're walls in Johannesburg with an armed guard at the gates, or whether they are an Elysium type setup, or whether they are in New Zealand in bunkers. And everyone else sort of fends for themselves in some sort of a totalizing state, where they're somehow subjugated either to a very powerful state entity or to a very powerful, let's just call it what it is, a Bitcoin warlord. Because I predict 2021 is going to be the year that the Bitcoin bros and hoes realize that they're going to need to invest in private armies to defend their stuff if they want to keep any of it. But all those roads, whether you've read The Sovereign Individual and you're a hardcore libertarian on the way rights, or whether you are a believer in big governments and the UN and the EU and the World Economic Forum's idea of you'll own nothing and you will be happy, the actual lived reality that's being put on the table for almost all of us, other than the perhaps top 100,000 odd elites, is this idea of sort of a smaller indentured servitude life whereby you are essentially controlled by some other entity who gets to live on the other side of the world. So it's like it's a contemporary, slightly more sanitized version of the sort of the feudal system, right? Where we sort of either selling ourselves through personal tokens or through accepting a universal basic income. It's the same thing, guys. I mean, like, you're coming at it from very different angles, but the amoeba strip of politics and history is merciless in that regard. Where essentially that's the only vision on the table. The only difference is who gets to be on the other side of the wall. And I think it speaks to the basic premise of this book, that we don't have to accept that. We don't have to accept that as being the only endpoint, just for like all over, but for the fighting over who gets to sit on the chairs, you know, shuffling the chairs on the proverbial Titanic deck. And further on, the inevitability of, oh, humanity is going to be superseded by some like stone-cold technological intelligence. That seems to be the only option on the table, no matter who you speak to. And Mathana was trying to get at that too. Like, the space doesn't change anything. It's like same shit, different day. And like we need to change that conversation. And if there's one thing people can take away from this book, it's that we can reject that wholesale and be like, actually, I don't care who's selling me this story. I don't want that story. I don't care what you're calling it. I don't care if you're branding it sort of fully automated luxury communism or the sovereign individual. It's the same shit. And I'm not actually participating in that project. I actually would prefer a future where we all get to tend and own our own gardens, for example. Or what's your idea of a more fruitful, prosperous future is? Because there's nothing more depressing than a one-size-fits-all future sort of being imposed or lowered upon us. That encourages nostalgia, encourages deaths of despair. We see this. This is what the developing world where I live and the very developed world where Theo live have in common. The youth have no hope. All youth have no hope because they don't see any opportunity. The youth on the other side of the world, the developed side of the world, have no hope because they've been told that the only future ahead is a planned, managed degrowth economy, whether it's run by a benevolent or malevolent AI, or whether it's run by a massive overreach of an EU government that sort of is controlling every aspect of their lives, or through a more sort of China hybrid surveillance system. They feel stifled. There's no way to grow. There's no way to move, because every way they look, it's the same vision being sold, this vision of a smaller, more contained, more controlled future where they have no agency, no privacy, as you were speaking about, no free will. They are passive pawn in a game that they have no control over. And in the developed world, again, for some similar reasons, but not quite the same, rather just because there is no opportunity. Quite frankly, South Africa, where I live, is a preview of that neo-feudal sovereign individual / you will own nothing, but they'll pay us the UBI future. We've got it all. We have compounds. And it's not a particularly wonderful future that I want to sell to my daughter. Like, you get to choose either to compete for one of the elite seats at the very elite table, and you get to be the boot that stomps on someone else's face, or you have to just sort of submit to having your face stomped on for the rest of your future. I mean, that's quite a dramatic way to put it, but this is the way I see it. The stakes are very, very high here. And the problem is that same idea that's being sold by all the voices. No one is presenting anything else. No one is saying, wait a minute, you are a free individual with a free will, and you can actually do something different. We need more choices, not less. And I think that it comes back to old Robert Nozick and his Anarchy, State, and Utopia. The whole point of Utopia is there's no such thing as a utopia if you can't escape from it. So, you know, like we try to sort of show people where the exit signs are on this airplane, you know, like the exits over here, follow the red lines. Like, you don't have to barrel down to earth on this tin can, right?
Yeah. I think that's part of the issue as well. It's what you just said about how you're either the aggressor or you're the victim. And those are the only two choices that you have. You're either the capitalist hungry individual who is the aggressor, in whether you actually are aggressor, whether you're not, whether that's yet to be decided, I guess. Or you are the victim, you're the person who can't have the opportunity to do that. But then I feel like that's it. You're either the aggressor, or you're the victim. And you're either playing one of those two games, which I feel is very narrow-minded.
That's one future. That's one binary option. Like, the whole point of utopias is to have many of them. You know, like I choose mine, you choose yours, because quite frankly, if I tried to make you do everything I wanted in the world, you'd be very unhappy, and I would definitely not like your version of the future because I have my own ideas about everything. You know?
That's interesting that you picked up on that. Yeah, the fact that individuals have their own way of thinking, and I feel like that has lost its individualism, has lost its power, I feel like. And it's really disappointing, because it feels like you have to do something, you have to like this, you have to like that, and there's no sovereign individual. And I don't know particularly what the reasons are. I mean, in Neil Postman's book Amusing Ourselves to Death, he talks about the fact of the television and the radio, about how the fact that the television was actually the reason about why humans have lost their interest in things that are actually important, whether it's their own sovereignty or whatever it might be. And I don't know whether it's, I feel like if you're out there and you're talking about how technology is bad for the human state, you almost seem as someone who doesn't like progress. But I feel like we need to have a conversation about, like you said earlier, Bronwyn, about what this technology is actually doing to us as humans. But I feel like anytime you raise that, you almost seem as some sort of infidel in some way.
I think that what it really boils down to is that there are issues of common goods issues when it comes to technology, but there are also issues of individual goods issues. I think like the Ivan Illich sort of ideas behind this are quite interesting, and that he said that, you know, when some people got to drive around in a car, it meant that everyone else was suddenly had to drive around a car, or they were handicapped in comparison. And that's the sort of common goods challenge with technology, that if I adopt it, you're kind of forced to adopt it or be materially left behind. So perhaps the conversations need to have, coming back to more sort of like Mathana's ideas of how do you allow space, hold space for people to opt out of this without becoming less than. So it's like, you don't have to be fast in order to be valuable. And we don't seem to have been able to identify with that as a society, that we can hold space for people to adopt technology as they want it, not being opposed that everyone has to do it because of network effects. It only works if everyone does it. And I think that's what the real issue is that we're trying to debate, whether it's through policy or through sort of neo-Luddite movements going on. It's not technology that's bad per se, but there is a real fear, and probably a justified fear, that if some people sort of genetically enhance their kids, or if some people get sort of neurochips, that if you don't, you won't have a place in society at all. If you don't get a vaccine passport, you can't play in society. You know, it's all part of the same conversation, this idea that you're being forced to progress when you'd also maybe you want to live life in a different way. And how do we hold space for that? So it's like we've been grappling with conversations around race and gender for so long. And we're learning to live together, even though there are differences in culture and in sort of biology and all these things. Much as we can pretend they're not, there are differences there. They're not, but it's not better than or worse than. It's how do you hold space? And these are what the identity questions, which are like, I know we're treading on very thin ice here, are all about. Because people across the gender spectrum, across the racial paradigms across the world, are wanting to be accepted for who they are without losing their identity. And it comes back to those ideas of identity and privacy and holding space back from society. And you run into problems on both ends of that spectrum when you try force everyone to be the same, or to pretend gender does not exist, or to pretend that, you know, race doesn't exist. Then you sort of bounce around the back again, you know, and you sort of end up like running around on that infinite loop that doesn't actually end up getting anywhere. You have to be able to hold those two opposing ideas in hand in order to build a successful society. I suppose I can probably speak about this because I do live in a very sort of fractured society. It's had moments of trying to embrace diversity, and then moments of trying to smother diversity, and moments of trying to put different types of diversity in opposition to each other. And the answers come on finding middle ground. It's not an either or, it's more of an and conversation. So how do we hold space for people that want to embrace becoming a cyborg, like Nick in our book, versus people like Mathana, who would like much more to see a much more sort of equitable world. But how do you hold space for both of those ideas at the same time? We don't have all the answers, but we can start to talk about the questions. I mean, all we've got is, 280 pages in our book, Theo. I mean, we can't change the whole world, but we can start.
Can give it a try. And I almost think the question,
articulate the problems.
Yeah, I almost think the question is more important than the answer sometimes. Raising the question. And
doctors will tell you diagnosing the problem is much harder than treating it. So, I mean, like once you've diagnosed it, you know, there's only a certain amount of treatments, then you can try it. You might kill the patients or not, but I mean, like, you know, there's like a finite range of solutions there. But when it comes to sort of diagnosing what's going on, that's probably the most important thing we can do. And we have to be honest about it, that they're not like simple solutions here. but there has to be space so that it's not ends up being some people that win and other people that lose. I think that's a problem with a lot of the global challenges. Most of the problems in the book are global challenges, in that we try to impose a sort of one world government order onto these things and say, we're going with the majority says, but in a sort of split world where in things like genetic engineering, or even in questions over things like border control, the world is pretty much evenly split right down the middle. And if you try and pose one solution onto everyone, you're upsetting half the world's population at every single turn. The way to do that is to actually put up more different spaces that people can live lives in different ways. It comes back to this idea of not having a homogenous one-size-fits-all future. And that might mean having different nations, different states, different geographic regions that have different tolerances to these different visions of the future, and finding ways to hold space between them without increasing that conflict again. It's always that balance between cooperation and conflict. We have to have both if we want to go anywhere. You can't go full cooperation or it's stagnant, and you can't go full conflict or everyone dies. You know, I mean, neither of these are particularly exciting ones. Either you die of old age and staleness, or you die violently and horribly. The only way to progress is to find that dynamic tension between these ideas, and to have space for there to be outliers across every level and every one of these challenges. So it's about more views and more complicated solutions sometimes. And complicated solutions mean actually having more simple rules, that you give people space to make their own more complicated choices. It's like ethics. The one-size-fits-all ethics is pretty evil pretty fast when you start going down.
It turns into an ideology, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
And it turns out like the early 1900s. And you're like, wonderful.
That's why stable moral systems, religious systems, legal systems have simple rules, and they allow individuals space to play within them. So some families would adopt different values and ethics systems to others. So anyway, there's some sort of broad thoughts on what a lot of the problems in this book have in common. They're common goods problems that by choosing A or B, yes or no, switch on or off, is going to make things worse. So it's about turning that tightrope, and the only way to do that is to have lots of people talking about these things all the time.
Yeah, definitely. Part of the thing, and the last thing I really wanted to discuss was the last part of the book. You mentioned the Norway's living library of the future, and you discussed like the long now. And I feel like the mindset shift needs to be from, okay, well, how can we profit from this technology or this what we're creating in 10, 20, 30 years, whatever it is. And it's like, how can we create a society and an environment for our future generations to flourish, and what is the long now? And I feel like that perhaps ending in the book that in that sort of vein possibly was a design on your part, or both of yours part. But how does a long now get established globally? Is it a mindset shift, or is there some sort of system change that needs to happen?
I think it's everything. So the system change is having people in leadership positions who have that kind of view for a start, not short-termism, but the longer picture, or the bigger picture, and then also that the bigger picture involves everybody as well. And then we need to start, and then that kind of sort of attitude filters down, because, like you say, that we're not asking the right questions. I feel, or people have just stopped asking questions altogether. You have that kind of binary view where it's like the fear of missing out. You either have or you don't have, and which camp do you want to be in? And of course, that forces you to think very short term as well, because it's almost like I need to make this decision now so that I can be happy now, and then you kind of lose the whole aspect of what do I want to be happy about in 50 years time, and how's that going to affect my kids and their kids and their kids, kind of sort of thing. And so it's everybody's responsibility to start asking questions about the future, and if someone says, well, this decision will mean in the next 10 years we do this, someone needs to stand up and say, right, well, what does this mean for 30 years time then? What's the knock-on effect in 50 years time? What are the knock-on effects and the compound effects of someone else taking action on that as a consequence of you implementing that? And and starting to plot that trajectory as to whether that's going to have a positive impact or a negative impact in those kind of sort of preceding years. So it's collectively our responsibility, society's responsibility, to ask the questions every time someone makes a decision that they say, oh, it's going to benefit us in 10, 15 years time. It's like, well, who is us? Who's it really going to benefit? What happens after that period of time? What happens if you get knocked over by a bus and someone comes along and changes the decision you made? And it was once positive, but now it's actually going on a completely different tangent. There's just not enough people asking questions. And hopefully at the end of this book, people want to ask those questions. They want to have a stake in the long now, not the now. And I think that's the problem. Everyone wants a stake of the here and now at the expense of because it's just not my problem. We've got Greta Thunberg banging her drum about the climate change because it is her problem, but it will also be her children's problem and future generations as well. But everyone in seats of power, whether it's somebody running an oil conglomerate, whether it's someone profiting from that from a governmental position or whatever, making those decisions, it's just like, well, I don't care what happens because I'm not going to be around. And this is the problem. It's just like, if I'm not there to benefit from it, why do I care? I'll just take my money and I'll spend it now, and I'll enjoy my life and then let them worry about it. And that's a societal problem and a problem probably fed by the system, in a sense, that you must just think about the next 20 years, think about yourself, don't worry about the rest of it. Someone else will deal with that for you. No, it's, we have to deal with it as well. So
the interesting question I think that you ended the book with, and I think that the reader will take away, is what can they do as an individual, but then how does their interest as an individual fit into the collective? So I think it's balancing the individual rights and the individual feelings and about what they want to do and how that maps in with the collective. And I think that the book definitely raises important questions, and it raises important questions to the reader, to how they see themselves fitting into society, and then how society determines that. So we talked about many different topics, and thank you both for taking the time to discuss your book, The Future Starts Now. Where's the best place where people can find you online, both of you?
I lurk on Twitter and on LinkedIn mostly. I don't really go for Facebook or anything else like that. And I've got my own website if anyone wants to sort of pop a question on a contact form as well.
Okay, perfect.
Likewise, you can find me quite easily on Twitter at Brownyn Williams, the name on the screen over there. Otherwise, over at Flex Friends is where I do my work at my day job. We get to have slightly less esoteric conversations and slightly more relevant to organizational conversations.
But perhaps you want to integrate the esoteric from time to time?
Yeah, oh, we do. But you always get a surprise with us, right?
Okay, good. Got to keep it interesting. Thank you both of you for taking the time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content. Also, visit our website, www.booktalktoday.com, to subscribe and download the latest edition of our magazine. Join our mailing list to receive the first issue for free, to get a taste for the value-packed content that we are offering. Book Talk Today, for readers, by readers.